the spirituality that is implicit in the principles and the practices of nonviolent communication, the spirituality that is the work that I call living compassion. So there's a relationship between what I experience as nonviolent communication, the principles, but there's deeper implications that I've made explicit through this, and in particular what I call the spirituality of the process. So do the best you can to, this is an intellectual or conceptual framework. Don't get too lost or caught up if you're not following it, but I think it gives some sort of conceptual support for the practices that we're going to engage in. So one of the ways that I conceptualize this work in conjunction with a lifelong spiritual practice, the traditional or esoteric spirituality is focused on the realization of the self. Self-realization, whatever they want to call it, awakening. And so the focus on the individual inner being, the self, whatever that is, it has different names. And my own, I guess, awareness or discovery of what is the relationship between the essential nature of what nonviolent communication is, which I see as the universal human needs. How are the needs related to spirit or the self? And this is just a simple framework that I've come to. Let's just say we start from the top down. We say that essentially what our true nature is what it is. And I use words like the self, soul, and inner being synonymously or interchangeably. They're the same word that refers to the same reality. And if we are to live the self in life, live who we really are in life, which is my experience, what I sense to be that this is what life is about, this is our purpose in some form or another. How do we access this direct recognition and living of the self? And one of the ways, if we were to look at the unfolding, what I call that, if the self or the soul is to unfold, one of the first elements that we find are there are properties or qualities of the self, that this is naturally who we are. I've heard Marshall years ago said that we are naturally compassionate. Many spiritual teachers talk about the natural compassion that is essentially our being. So compassion is not separate from the self. It is a property of the self. We are naturally that way. And there are different qualities like love, freedom, whatever the many different qualities are, when we can actually have a direct experience of the nature of the self. Maybe creativity. And so most, I think, spiritual practices are around coming to a direct experience, a direct awakening, and then a living in what our true nature is, living the self in life. But how do we access that? We can't get the direct experience by simply reading about it or thinking about it. It's not an intellectual experience, it's a direct experience. There are many approaches to it. The approach that I find to be very helpful is the way that we can access the qualities of the self is through the heart. So this is something we can feel. When we feel our longings, that's not an intellectual exercise. The longings of the heart are ways that is a way, a pathway, a portal, through which we can actually start to directly feel the nature of the self. So that when I am in the experience of longing, when I long for a quality of being, longing for freedom, longing for clarity, awakening, fullness. For me, these longings are the way that we can directly access the nature and the qualities of our inner being. And then one of the beautiful elements of nonviolent communication is it helps us to identify the the human needs, our universal human needs, which I see as the core element of this process. And so for me, needs are an aspect of the longings. When I can touch into my deep longings for freedom, then I can identify that as a need for freedom, or the value that I hold for living freely, freely choosing, not acting from obligation, from sense of pressure, but acting from the sense of freely choosing what it is that I want to live in my life. And so when I further look at the unfolding, the universal human needs and values unfold or are connected or linked to the longings of the heart. It can be said that they're modifications of the longings, still the same energy, the same quality. So in this way, our universal human needs are a doorway to spirit, where we can actually feel the embodied energetic quality of our needs. And when we are feeling this sense of authenticity and wholeness, we don't always recognize it consciously. And so that's another step. But my experience is that we are actually living in and inhabiting the qualities of our true nature. So it's no longer an abstraction. When I feel love embodied, purely, the kind of love that's unconditioned, kind of love that has no history, but the quality of love that I live in relationship to life and others, I'm actually inhabiting the nature of my being, of the nature of the soul. And this is, I believe, is one of the highest purposes of life. This is the purpose of life as I experience it. And if it resonates with you, then it is true for you too. But so for me, one of the things that nonviolent communication adds, I think, or completes the spirituality of awakening is that it's not just realizing the self, but it's coming to live fully the self in life, the self in relationship. It means as we navigate how we can be with one another by communicating our true self in others and seeing them in their needs. I mean, this is one of the principles of nonviolent communication, is that one of the principles is that I am always expressing myself in life, my true self. So it's a twofold spiritual practice. Actually, let me just so that the self, soul, inner being expresses through a life force. It's not an abstraction. It's a living, vibrating, feeling life force that we feel in and through the body. The life force manifests through our emotions. Everything that is our aliveness is our life force. The life force manifests through our thinking. Every manifest form of life is an expression of a modification of the life force. And then the life force then further, in a more specific and focused way, manifests as my longings, my needs, and my values. And this is one of the essential features of the work that we'll be participating in this week. So we talk about life force, we're really talking about that subtle but strong quality of aliveness and energy that is dynamic and always moving in and through me. So anytime anyone wants to pause and ask a question for clarification, please don't hesitate. There's a lot of material here, so. Well, what I say is that longings are the same needs, are the same as needs, in a different modified form. It's the same energy. So if I long for belonging in a group, that longing is a quality of my life force, longing for a particular quality of living in life. And I may identify it as belonging. So there's a very specified quality that I long for. Same thing, you're languaging it in a different way. I say, I have a need for belonging, I long for belonging. It is a manifestation of my life force that moves me towards living in a community of people, whether it's family or whatever. And belonging is to participate in life in the particular way that I call belonging. So I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a point here that I think is really valuable in living this process, whether you want to call it nonviolent communication or living compassion, which is the use of language and the terminology that we use to experience and to express our experience. It's very important that we are able to hold our language loosely and not be too dogmatic and locked into a particular language or word as how we express this dynamic flow of our experiencing. So some of the language that I'm using may sound a little bit different than the way or the jargon that we use or that we've discovered or that we practice in nonviolent communication. So the questions for clarification are useful, so I appreciate hearing that. I'm hoping that as you hear these words, you are maybe sensing into it and feeling intuitively what I'm saying, as well as intellectually. So even as you're hearing me now as I'm speaking, my sense is that you are receiving these words. Your being is receiving them. There is a life energy and a life force coming from me to you, and you're receiving them and taking them in. And they are either resonating in you, or maybe there's a dissonance and not so much a resonance. Whatever the case is. So, and in this work, there's what I call, these are like these overriding sort of general contexts. So I consider that this is a twofold way of living, a twofold spiritual life practice. And that's really all it is. I like to sort of live in the space of simplicity with this. Just when I get into complexity, then I tend to go into my mind and get confused and lose the simplicity of being, the simplicity of simply being alive. So the simplicity of how I see this twofold spiritual life practice is that if it's true that who I am, what my nature is, the truth of this being, this individuality I call the self or the soul, is the purpose and the force of being in life is to live fully in life. That means in the flow, without freed from the obstructions of anger and fear and violence and judgment. If that's my purpose, then a life, one part of the spiritual life practice is to cultivate. It means to develop and live in this flow. One of the practices that I've developed is the dyad meditation on the beauty of needs. The term beauty of needs is a phrase that refers to an experience. It's the experience that's more important, not the phrase. So this is a practice. When we cultivate, and we'll, after I do this talk, we'll invite you into an experience. I'll guide you into a whole group experience of what I mean by this. So when we have an experience of fulfillment, of enjoyment in life, when we experience that most of the time when we're in an experience of fulfillment or enjoyment, we can say that something is being fulfilled. Our needs are being fulfilled. What we value is being fulfilled and met. When we are in this experience, it's a total experience. And we don't necessarily reflect on it or think about it. We're just immersed in it. When we're in this experience, it's an embodied experience. All of us participates. You might think of an experience in which you were in enjoyment or fulfillment. Something was really going your way or working for you. When we reflect on it, there is an embodiment, a sense, and there's sensations that go with this. You can call it excitement, thrill, clarity, groundedness, a sense of empowerment, play. All of these qualities are inherent when we are living in the flow. And there's the part of the practice, a good part of the practice in this work that we'll engage in is developing and cultivating this flow. It happens perhaps accidentally for most of us, but I think it's an important practice to be able to develop. What do I do to cultivate this flow? And there are a number of ways that we can do it. I'm sure there are ways in your own individual life and your own practices that you have found to cultivate the flow.